In this video, we're going to be going over 7 of the most common feedback tips that I give to my students. This is stuff I've learned giving hundreds of hours of feedback over many years of music production education, and today I want to share those insights with you. Now, I will be opening up our feedback sessions to the public very soon, so you're actually welcome to come and attend one of these and get professional feedback on your music. The link to join the waiting list will be down below, and with that, let's hop into today's video. Now, tip 1 is all about balancing your low end and mid range in the mix to achieve maximum loudness. Low end often drives into the limiter first, which means you have to really gauge it with your fader balancing and your master EQ to make sure it's not causing too much distortion on your limiter. Check it out. This is sick so far. If I had any feedback from like an overall level, it would be just to this is what I would do. I would pull down like with a low shelf, 100 hertz and below, maybe 80 hertz and below, but like 1 dB, 2 dB. And then I would bring the overall mix into my limiter an extra 1, maybe 2 dB. Just a subtle skewing of the mids and highs up in the mix would just help it feel that tiny bit more complete without making the rumble quieter, because it feels like that rumble is just a tiny bit too much, overpowering the rest of the track. By the way, the amount of times I've done that on people's tracks, like in the producer launchpad, I've just like pulled down the lows and brought up the highs in the limiter. It just like completes the mix down. It's crazy. So it definitely works. Like, don't sleep on it. I would love for you to do this exercise. Grab a high pass filter and a low pass filter. Put the high pass at like, let's say 150 hertz, maybe 200 hertz. Put the low pass at like, I want to say like 3 to 4 kilohertz. Listen to the mid range and then flick the EQ on and off as you listen to it back and forth. And then what it will tell you is how much of the mid range, the body of the track, right, is there in comparison to the lows and the highs. I think you may find you may just need a tiny bit more mid range in the track just to let the main synths come through. Now, that could be fixed in mastering. My suggestion would be just to bring up some of those mid-range elements in the actual mix, just that tiny bit more. Really sick track, man. Look, it's like 99% done, if I'm honest. These improvements I'm suggesting are very minor. I do like this significant breakdown in the middle of the track. Part of me wants to hear a little bit more of an intro without the kick drum coming in yet. I mean, if we just look at the waveform here simply as it is, the kick and the rumble occupying most of the mix for most of the arrangement, obviously is going to create a certain level of energy. So whether we can deviate from that, whether it's these little fills you have here or full breakdowns, is great. Maybe towards the end there, you could do something like that, sort of mute the rumble or mute the kick or high pass them both for a second or something. Just variation in the low end is going to let your track breathe. And it's not that you haven't done it. I think there's just a few little moments you could consider that. And honestly, guys, like, this is for everybody. If you send me something that's like nearly done and I don't think it needs a lot, like, I will say that, because I can always give feedback on something, right? And I did still give feedback on this track. But at the same time, if it's close to being released, I want you to put your music out and I will tell you if that's the case. So this is definitely one that I think is in that case. So tip number 2 is about the importance of using reference tracks. And I cannot stress how important reference tracks are in accelerating your journey and skipping all the mistakes I made, because you're using a professional product to guide your own production decisions. It's kind of a no-brainer. Let's check it out. I like the bass there. It needs, like, I think that pattern is really cool. It just needs a sub bass layer. So like a sine layer down the octave or something. I think what you should do is go pull in like a favorite drum and bass track and look at the structure as a reference track and like kind of let your structure roughly match a drum and bass structure. Because this is kind of just at this point probably more of a loop. I think as well the drum pattern itself, the actual rhythm of the drums, it's like the same every 4 sort of bars. I would make it different, like every 4 bar version. So there's like one 4 bars, and then there's a second 4 bars with a different sort of similar but slightly different pattern, just so it feels like an 8-bar loop. Just feels like it's could do with a bit more variation. And by the way, drum loops in drum and bass tend to be like 16 bars. That tends to be like one section. So I really like the bones of this track. The main elements feel pretty solid. It's a little bit more on the chill, slower drum and bass side, which is fine. Some of the melodies, especially towards the middle there was some counter melodies that just felt like they didn't flow super well, but most of the stuff melodically does work. I think the issue here is structure and mixdown, and also just the arrangement, lack of solid sub bass, which drum and bass definitely needs. So pull in a reference track, use it for the arrangement purposes, use it for mixing purposes as well. And I think you'll go a long way, because this is a really solid idea. Just needs to be fleshed out into something that has that flow dialed in, Douglas. So would love to hear you definitely work on this though, because it's a very good idea. I love the melodic like chords as well. The energy in that is really, really good. So it just needs a full fleshing out, man. So tip number 3 is to create contrast between your build and your drop to maximize its impacts. So a few things that producers often overlook. Let's have a look. The low end response in the drop is not as it's not as full in the sub frequencies as I would expect it to be for the drop. I also think in the beginning of a drop, what you generally speaking want to do is keep it fairly focused on like the core elements that really make it the drop, and like save, little background sort of counter melodies and other stuff like supporting elements. Maybe they can come in later in the drop, because you really want to introduce the core idea in the drop in all of its glory right there, and then kind of let everything else kind of come in through over time. I think here there's a bit too much starting at the beginning of the drop. There's not as much emphasis on the core elements and the frequency response of those. Even, like there could be more like of a lower bass layer to kind of fill in the low end a little bit more. It treats you like I do. Nobody will love you. I think also you've got like kind of two melodic elements competing for each other, that kind of pluck and the vocal. It seems to be mostly vocal dominated. I just feel like I'm wondering if you could kind of space out the use of the vocal in the drop a bit more to allow that lead pluck to kind of shine a bit more and be a bit more spacious with the vocal. Basically just simplify it a little bit, I think would be a big benefit. This drop is way better. See how it's more stripped back and simple, and I can hear the bass. This is more what I would want from the first drop, somewhat similarly. Little pro tip, when you transition from like a 4 on the floor to kind of like a halftime sort of beat like you do here, emphasize the transition a bit more, because it's quite a foundational change in the structure of the song. So, mute the drums a bar before, have a little fill, add some sweeps and effects, more so than what you've done here, just because you really want to emphasize, have an impact on the one of the next section, really indicate to the listener what's happening. There's a big kind of switch here, because this just kind of feels like, just change the pattern, and it doesn't quite give the moment as much emphasis as it could. Be my recommendation. So tip number 4, if your snare game is weak, like 99% of producers, I'm just kidding, you need a master sample selection. So let's take a look at how you can improve yours. Okay, so really, really, really cool idea so far. Really love the acid kind of, the really distorted acid bass sort of thing in the build here. A really cool. So from a build perspective, after this idea, I like how it kind of modulates and stuff like that, builds up here. It feels like the build kind of could be a little bit more hypey right before the drop. For example, that like vocal pad in the background that could like start pitching up or something, and then maybe right before the first drop of the hit of the drop, like the main bass kind of high passes back down into it, and then it smacks in with that first kick. Just a little touch there just to transition that into the build a little better. Now, as for the actual drop feedback, so there's a few things here. Firstly, I'll say I think the issue here is that the snare, first of all, I don't think the snare selection is the best. For example, back here, I feel like maybe not exactly something as stripped back as that. Something a little snappier and poppier rather than like a chunky kind of neuro snare would be, I feel, a little bit better. It also feels like the transient on the snare, for whatever reason, is just getting slammed. I'm mostly just hearing the tail. I don't know if anyone else can hear that, but like the snare transient just isn't crisp. It's not crisp. It's not cutting through. It could be sound card compression, so that is part of the factor there. But honestly, I think the easiest solution would just be considering both those issues, would just be to find a better sample, something a bit snappier, a bit more modern as well. I think the second issue here is you got an acid bass line. Now, there is definitely some sub in this drop. However, I can't really tell where it's coming from. I can't tell, is it just the low end of the acid bass? Is it a separate sub? My personal opinion would be to layer in a sort of lower end bass sound underneath that acid bass, like it's sort of like a bong, 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 bong sort of bass that has all the sub content in it, lifts the energy and the low end response of the drop, and is like the perfect complement to the kind of acid sort of thing in the drop. Just because I like the acid sound, but due to the distortion, I think it just needs a cleaner, like low-end kind of bass pluck layer. So I think if you do those two things, I just think that the drop will come across a lot better. Anthony, you mentioned you always had that problem with snares as the transient gets crushed. It could just be going into a clipper or a limiter a bit too hard. Because if you push it too hard, the transient at first the transient gets just controlled a little bit, but you still feel it. But if you push it too hard, you just kind of end up hearing the body. So tip 5 is something that isn't talked about nearly enough, and it's your ability to balance the standards of your genre against your own original sound that you're trying to bring in. This tension is really difficult to achieve, but if you do it right, you can get an original sounding song that still meets listener expectations. Check it out. There's a lot of awesome, cool, unique stuff, but I think there's a few like kind of fundamentals that are probably neglected. And this is not just like a unique problem to this track or you as a producer, by the way. This is a more general kind of thing, I think. It's like looking at your style or genre, and then like you've got your own kind of stamp on that genre, right? But your own stamp doesn't just happen in isolation. And I think there's this balance between, hey, what actually works in my style and genre? And hey, how can I add my own flair on this so I stand out from the crowd? And I think you're leaning more towards this side, which is actually a really, really, really good thing. But I think as well, there's a lot to be learned about the fundamentals a little bit more from a mixing standpoint, from a sound selection standpoint, from a compositional standpoint. And this would be just stuff like going and looking on like, look at more like YouTube tutorials on how to make this style. There's a lot to be learned from the basics of this particular style of music, right? So that's what I think would be worth just delving into a little more here, is like, what's the basics and how can I then put my own flair on that, which I'm already quite good at. So yeah, hopefully that makes a lot of sense. Really enjoyed the track. Again, really good sound design and stuff like that. Hopefully this gives you a little bit to work towards. So tip number 6 is all about creating, from a mix perspective and a composition perspective, balance between your drum patterns and your bass. Whether you're trying to achieve sort of a groovy pattern or whether you're just trying to create this cohesive wall of sound, getting your drums and bass balanced together is crucial for your track sounding professional. Let's see the feedback I've given in the past. If I'm honest, it gets a little too busy for me towards the end there with the extra drums. I think it's just like, if you're if you think about it like this, if you're going a bit crazier with the drums, like rhythm, like you're adding a few more snare rolls, that's a faster rhythm, double time or whatever, you may have to compromise on the side of like the busyness of the basses and the vocals all kind of contributing to one. That makes sense, just because you're having more frequent drums and the same basses that are quite busy already. You're going to get a bit more of a messy sort of mix. So if you're getting busier in one area, maybe it's time to pull back and simplify in another area of your arrangement. Also, I think this song could have had a little bit more of an outro. I feel like it's a bit abrupt, but overall really cool. One other thing is I would like to hear a little bit more sub frequency. I reckon if you boosted up your sub like 1 dB, especially maybe even in the drop, you could automate that on your master, or you could even just automate if you have a separate sub track to go up 1 dB on the drop, just so that the bass in those like bass sounds just have a bit more weight to them. It's very minor because I can hear the sub is there very clearly. It's just that tiny bit too quiet for me personally. But I think it would just also help that you've got a lot of full spectrum bass sounds, and having that sub appropriately leveled will just give it that weight it needs, I reckon. So hopefully that gives some feedback that you can implement that, is actionable. But it's a really, really good song overall. I think it's got a nice vibe, very is a clear like aesthetic you're going for here. So I think you're like 90% of the way there. It's almost done. Just needs a few tweaks and cleanups and stuff like that. Okay, so last, number 7 is all about making sure that your tracks flow from beginning to end. A lot of people just chuck sections in their track and they just kind of are arbitrary and feel like they're so stop-start. So I want to show you how I give feedback on improving those section transitions and making your track feel smooth. So far with this track, I would say you kind of mentioned you're having a hard time with focus and you trying to figure out what you want to be the focus in any one section. I think when Connor talks about like having each section have a purpose, like whether it's a chorus, a drop, it's not so much that each section needs to be wildly different. Like I made that mistake when I was newer. I was like thinking each section had to be so vastly different. It's not necessarily the case. So there's some great ideas in this track. I do feel like they're quite different. Like some of the ideas, like you got this really awesome, like gospel-y, like organ with a lead synth going on in one section. And there is, sometimes it's nice to have a bit of juxtaposition, right? I'm not against completely different sections to an extent. They have to interweave somehow, and there has to be some context. Like whether it's, teasing, like for example, I feel like the organ could be a great way to open the song, and then kind of going into a breakdown where you kind of just strip the drums back, start to like filter up the bell sound into the drop, and then dropping like that's this part of the section, right? So this is like the drop, right, in my mind, not something I would use in the intro. And then I'd start with the organ, break down into like just the organ by itself, bring this in, tease it in. And then the way you do bring in the organ over time towards the end of the drop is cool. I think that, again, blends the context to these two juxtaposed things together quite nicely. So it's not so much the ideas you've got, it's the way it's arranged and the story it's trying to tell, right? Look at a song that has that juxtaposition between like a really nice melodic intro, maybe a gospel-y kind of intro, and a more kind of aggressive, or not, this isn't aggressive, it's more like different kind of vibe, more darker feeling drop, right? So look at a song that has that juxtaposition, kind of copy the structure of it, to be honest, and see how they interplay between these two elements and go from there. Yeah, so I really think the one thing this song just needs is just good structure. There's no shame in just honestly getting a song similar or same BPM and just copying the structure and even some of the transitional techniques that song is using, because your ideas are not the same as that song's ideas necessarily. It's still your song, but just seeing how that song flows energy from one section into the next, there's no shame in doing that. And it will just contextualize things a bit better. And it will be like, oh, this bit can go here. And that makes a lot more sense than having it over here. So there's no shame in doing that. I think that's a great exercise to do, because that's honestly what will just tie this track together. And then a few more basic things like adding effects, sweeps, transitions. And again, the reference track would help with this and how they do it. Noticing how things transition between sections using different techniques. white noise sweeps, rises, whatever that is. Honestly, it's a good song, man. It's just the structure. I'd love to see this finished because it's got a lot of potential. So that's just 7 of the most common things. Honestly, there's probably hundreds at this point that I've encountered over the years. So if you do want to get professional feedback from me, I am opening our regular feedback streams to the public very soon. You can join the waiting list and get announcements to your email below at the link. And lastly, if you do want to work with me closely on a one-on-one basis, check the link down below in the description underneath the original one for information on my producer launchpad program. I help producers bring their music up to professional quality by giving them week-on-week regular feedback dedicated to their specific needs as a producer. We dive into projects, tweak things, and really get you feeling confident to send your music out into the world. So if you want to learn more, click that. And until next time, happy producing.